We had Sean McCormick on the show a little while ago, and he said he knew he was in the right room when he saw us bumping around and grooving to that intro music. But it's just we can't help it. Thanks. I have to thank again Peter Trulin for putting that amazing track together and sharing it with us. Because you're in for a treat when you hear that tune. Because it's time for another week of the Rec Poker podcast. As I say every week, I've got the best freaking job in the world. I get to hang out here on Monday nights and talk to my friends about poker. My name's Jim Reed. I'm Bluff Sterini in the home game and at Rec Poker Jim on Twitter. My friends, my poker friends that we're talking about here are the Wrecking Crew members and the premium members here at Rec Poker, which is this awesome community that I'm glad I joined in 2019. It's really turned my poker game around. I dare say it's even turned me around. I'm a better person for having joined Rec Poker, and I hope if you're listening to this, you'll consider signing up for a free account right now. Head on over to rec.poker. All it takes is an email address and a smile. If you want to find out more about the other members of the Wrecking Crew, the real magic makers over here, you can go to rec.poker/crew, but you can just listen up also because you're going to meet a few of them here on the show tonight.
Well, I am Chris Jones. You can find me 5B5 on Twitter or 5x5 in the Poker Stars home game.
And I'm Rob Washam, and you can find me as Rabman50 just about everywhere.
I'm Taylor Moss. You can find me on Twitter at Taylor_Moss or in the home games as Gopher Boy TJM.
And I've mentioned before, Rec Poker is a largely volunteer-based organization. Most of what we do here is free, but we have a rigorous and vibrant premium membership here. And I really appreciate when our premium members come join us on the show every once in a while. It's one of the perks of being a premium member is you get to come chat with the panel. Today, we're being joined by Doug Behrens, a longtime OG of Rec Poker and one of our premium members. Doug, thanks for coming on the show. Why don't you tell Rec Poker Nation where they can find you?
I'm now then KB on ACR and Poker Stars, and just a retired guy who plays poker recreationally. Been doing that about 15 years, I suppose now.
Sounds like you're living the dream. That's Now Then KB. You've probably seen him in the home game club. And Doug's been a great member of Rec Poker for a while. Thanks for joining the show tonight. So we are going to be looking at a forum post by none other than Rob Washam. Rob's been on a roll lately. He's been not only contributing in the forums, but having great results on the felt, but also being a really active member of the forums edition of the podcast lately. So I love when we get to get inside Rob's brain. This one is called Using HUD Stats. And I'll just tee you up a little bit here, Rob. So you've been playing some micro stakes cash lately online. You play 6 max on ACR, and ACR is one of the sites that allows a HUD, and it's the same players. Players have the same name from session to session, so you're actually able to collect a reasonable sample size on players, which makes a big difference when it comes to the sample size is king when it comes to a lot of these HUD statistics. The theme of the month for June is all about deviating from GTO, reads, and like HUD stats, this kind of thing, finding ways to work outside the textbook to maximize your profits against different players, different kinds of players. And so we're just kind of wrapping up the theme this month, talking about HUD stats as it relates to this post from Rob. So Rob, you are very good at note taking. I know that already. You're very conscientious when you're at the table. You're paying attention. You're detail oriented. It doesn't surprise me at all that you're paying a lot of attention to the HUD stats of the players next to you. What made you decide to make this forum post and talk a little bit about why these HUD stats are really important to you as you play?
Yeah, I just wanted to share with the Rec Poker Nation, I guess. One way you can use your HUD stats to take advantage and to exploit your opponents. So actually, there's 2 sets of HUD stats on here that I mentioned as I went through this. So I'm just going to go real quick through the hand what happened here. It folds to me in the cutoff, or no, I'm sorry. The low jack actually had a forced blind because they had just joined the table. So they had to put in a forced blind. So I bet from the cutoff to 3.5 big blinds, and the button raised me to 10 big blinds. I believe it was 10 big blinds, 3 bets, 10 big blinds, yes. And then it folds around back to me and I call. Now I have king queen suited, and king queen suited if you're playing against a GTO opponent, king queen suited is definitely a call. Okay, because it's if you're playing optimally, you're playing GTO solver, it's definitely a call. But in this case, I had 2 villains that I had quite a few hands on. One villain I have over 400 hands on, and I played with this guy a ton. And he is tighter than a drum. He's very, very focused on playing nothing but big cards. So if you see, his stats show that he's a 1% C better, or a 3 better. I'm sorry, 1% of the time after 450 hands, he has 3 bet. So I look at that and I say, okay, if I bet out with king queen and he 3 bets me, I'm folding in a heartbeat. So I'm exploitively folding to this guy because the only time he 3 bets is aces, kings, and queens. That's 1%. So, but the guy in the button, he's got a 19% C bet. So I'm going, he's C betting just about anything he's got. He's just trying to overpower anybody. 3 bets. Yeah. He 3 bets just about any hand. And I put a range here of what a 19% 3 bet would look like. And it's really, really wide.
It's a lot.
So
I know players that they only play 19% of hands. They only VPIP 19% of hands.
Yes.
And this guy is 3 betting with it. So this is an extremely wide range. Yes.
It's extremely wide. And I put it in here, aces, 4s through aces, ace 3 suited to ace king suited. So almost all the ace suiteds, king queen suited to king 8. And all I did was went into Flopzilla and just moved the slider over to 19 and came up with this range. I mean, so it's not real, I didn't do a lot of work on it. I just said, okay, what is that? And so I decided that this would be a good time to call. And so the flop comes out, king 4, 6, rainbow. And so I have top pair, pretty good kicker. And I check to the 3 better, and he bets 16.5 big blinds into the 23.5 big blind pot. And I call. I figure, he's going to be C betting with just about anything. And if you look at that C bet size on that flop, that doesn't make any sense at all from an optimal GTO standpoint. Mm-hmm. On that flop, you would probably expect to see a 33% type C bet. That's probably more what the solvers would say you should do. So we know that this guy is just trying to force people out of pots. And so the turn brings the 5 of hearts, brings the flush draw on, puts 2 hearts on the board. I check again, and now the villain bets 40.5 big blinds into a 56.5 big blind pot.
It's big.
And I'm going, no, this guy is full of beans. So I call again. And the river is the 2 of hearts, putting a possible flush on the board. And I check again with the intention of calling any bet. And he checks back, and we win the pot, which is 137.5 big blinds by now. So basically, my read on him was that he's a maniac playing marginal hands and trying to bet his opponents out of the pot. And his actual hand was ace 4 offsuit. So he paired the 4 on the flop and decided to go to town on this board. So there's 2 exploits here. The first one is I called this guy off because I know that he's a maniac playing way too many hands, way too hard. And the other player that is, I guess he's in the small blind, is a player that had he 3 bet, I would fold exploitively because his range would be so much stronger than my king queen suited.
I love that. I think people don't appreciate that folding can be a weapon. Like folding can be a weapon. It can be an aggressive, maybe it can't be an aggressive action, but the chips that you decline to put in other players' pockets, those chips spend just as well as the ones that you win in pots that you win from other people. Exploitative folds are a way that you get to take chips out of other people's pockets and put them in your own. Um, and just like I love, Rob, your approach here to this very aggressive player, because I think some people get into this point where, oh, this guy three bets so often, and then he like c bets so often. I should just be raising here because he can't have anything. And I understand the argument there, but no, what you should really do is you should be calling and letting him continue to bluff and not giving him an opportunity to play perfectly and fold the bad hands and only continue with the good hands. But it can be very difficult. You really have to screw up your courage and make those big calls. Like as you said, Rob, you were prepared to call any bet on the river here. Rob, when like sometimes he's gonna have had ace king, or he's gonna have had pocket kings or something, and you're gonna have the worst hand. It might even feel kind of stupid to have called in that situation, but I think you know that you're making the right play. How do you kind of, if you were telling someone else why this was the right play to make, how would you sort of like make them feel better about it if the guy turns over pocket kings there? You know what I mean? Because I feel like that tension is part of it.
Yeah, and very true. He could add pocket aces there. He could have had, ace king. He could have had me totally crushed. He could have had a set of fours. Who
Sure.
knows?
And that's a good point, because when they're wide like that, they could have anything. Like he could have a straight there or something like that too. But it's just such a small part of their range that we can't.
That's exactly what I was going to say. That if you look at, when you're doing range work and you're looking at how ranges hit different boards, you always look at what is their starting range. And if you look at their starting range compared to the board, and you look at the number of combinations of his starting range that misses compared to how many that hit, there is just so many more combinations of hands that miss this flop entirely than there are ones that hit it to that extreme. And my range was a lot smaller and a lot tighter. And so when I hit top pair on this, it's a very small portion of my range, right? There's a very small portion of my range that's going to call the kind of bet that he put out there. And so he's not paying attention to me. He doesn't even consider what I might have, because he continued to bet, just trying to overpower me and trying to push me out of the pot. And once I called on the flop, he should know that I have at least a king in my hand. What else am I calling with? A two pair, a set. I mean, there's not very many two pairs that I would have calling a three bet, right? So he's not considering my hand whatsoever. All he knows is that he three bet, he's going to overpower me. He's going to he's a maniac, basically. He's just going to put chips in the pot and hope I go away.
And I like the way that you've put that together. And it's true that, players that tend to be aggressive pre-flop also tend to be aggressive post-flop. And so you can kind of assume that they'll continue that aggression. And I liked your point about the sizing of the flop c-bet, because when the board comes king 4-6 rainbow, regular listeners will know that that's a spot where you should be making a c-bet at a high frequency with a low size and with a small sizing. And so when they choose not to do that, it does kind of reinforce that notion that the tool that they've brought is just muscle. They're just going to try and hammer you down with it. And you can take advantage of that by calling down light, even though it's hard to do. Mm-hmm. Taylor?
Yeah, I think the other point that's kind of along with that is like, we're talking about HUD stats. What can you do with HUD stats and how can you interpret those? There's certain things that HUDs don't track. And like one thing here that I would like really be noting is the sizing of like the flop bet. Because we went 3/4 pot. I think it's really good to know like how this hand played out, the sizing that they used in this specific spot, and keeping that information for future reference too, because you can gain that information around like how often are they doing certain things. But it's also really good to have those additional like tidbits of information. Same way if you have opponents that like they bet heavy when, you know, they've got marginal value and are trying to like push you off hands, or like they've got no value. But then when they hit a hand, then they're checking or betting small. It's really good to know those things, because you may have certain stats that come up, say they see bet a lot. But if you can take those notes and keep track of things, that they see bet big when they're trying to get you off of hands and see bet small when they're trying to like hook you in, that can add like an extra layer of knowledge with how you're going to approach these somewhat crazy opponents.
Yeah, very true. Chris, this is Chris Jones, who runs our membership content here. Chris has been putting these monthly themes together. The theme this month, as you've described, sort of getting away from the GTO theory of it and trying to find opportunities to exploit players. This feels like sort of one of those classic examples. How when you're playing live, because I think the HUD stats do make it very easy. When you're playing live, Chris, you've been thinking about this a bit lately. What are some of the kind of ways that we can use tells or physical information to help our assumption about the range of hands that our opponents have?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a number of things, right? Like, number one is, and this isn't my idea. I've, lots of smarter people than me have talked about this, but put away your phone, put away your, don't watch the game that much. And if there's a showdown, pay attention. Because if you see somebody here who's 3-bet, even ace 4 off is probably, I mean, as we saw from the range Rob was talking about, ace 4 offsuit is actually one of the more legitimate holdings that this player might show up to in this situation, right? They're going to have even some weaker stuff that might show up in this situation. And so particularly if you see somebody, like let's say that's a king 4-6 and you see this happening somewhere else, and you're not paying attention, stacks get in the middle and they are holding 4-6 offsuit, and they flop 2 pair and they stack somebody, and you're just like, oh, this guy's, I don't know, whatever, the Vikings game's on. If you're not paying attention to that, now you don't know that this player has been 3-betting with just wild hands. So that's like, I mean, a part number one is pay attention to showdown. But then I think you can sort of mash that together with player tendencies, player sort of like kind of what they're maybe how they're approaching the game, a little bit of what they're maybe wearing, what they have with them at the table. To actually, Taylor and I were just talking earlier today. There was an Inside the Mind of the Pro episode with Adrian Mateos, and he's playing this player. And this is it was the 10K 6-max tournament. There's some crushers at this tournament. The first table he shows up with has like Jason Kuhn and it's like a murderer's row. It's like Stephen Chidwick, Jason Kuhn. He gets moved to another table. It's later in the tournament, and there's somebody there who's like kind of an unknown, right? And he gets into this hand with this player, and it's one of the first hands he doesn't know him. He knows everyone else at the table. They're all regs. They're all whatever. But there's this unknown at the table, and he looks down and he's got this like. I don't know what to describe it as. It's like this crystal luck charm tree that he's got, might be his card protector, that's sort of sitting next to him at the table. And I think that's immediately like something that, like, if you see somebody with a luck charm, I think they're likely not as maybe studied or experienced in a poker sort of traditional sense. And so he gets into this spot with this player where if it's Jason Kuhn, he's got top pair with no kicker on like a Jack 10-4 deuce board or something like that. He has Jack 7 of spades, and it's the river. He makes a bet and he gets shoved on, and he's got to decide. And I think maybe against Jason Cooney might have to like GTO it out and make that call. But against this player, exactly, somebody who like has this luck charm that we can kind of see maybe is less experienced, they're not making a river check raise without the goods. And that's a kind of player read you can see live that's much easier to see than you can in an online environment.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. I wanted to talk about some other HUD stats here. Does anyone else want to talk about other sort of things that you might see live before we do? I think that is a good point. People can kind of out themselves as being, less studied or less, even just less comfortable at the table. Like, I think that's one thing. The mechanics of poker. I was playing in Niagara the other day, and there was a guy. There's a guy just a couple seats to my left who was talking about poker like they knew how many outs they had on the turn or something like that. But they were really clumsy with their chips, and they made a string bet early, and they also tried to raise by just putting one big chip in, and it was ruled a call. And you could just tell that this player was new to playing live, but that they had they'd obviously played online quite a bit. They had a grasp on poker strategy and the math behind it and that sort of thing. So it's there are kind of ways that you can kind of get a sense of maybe how experienced someone is or what they're comfortable with. Like, so much of poker is putting people in uncomfortable positions, right? So if you can put them in a position where they don't feel as comfortable or as studied, then usually that's a chance for them to make more mistakes or bigger mistakes than you. And that's what the key is for all this kind of stuff. Folks, we'll talk a little bit about some HUD stats that we think are super important when it comes to this. Obviously, everyone knows VPIP, voluntarily put in pot, PFR, pre-flop raise percentage, and 3-bet percentage. If you could only have 3 stats, those might be the 3 that you would pick to just sort of tell you a little bit about this player generally. I like to use raise first in instead of PFR because it actually lets me really crunch down on positionally, how positionally aware are they, and I just think it's more helpful when it comes to range construction. Rob, why don't you jump in there with a?
Well, I was just going to say I use a pop-up too, so I can click on my pre-flop stats here, and it'll pop up by position on what their VPIP and PFR is. So, I can get there. I just don't have it displayed all the time. I use a very simple HUD as you could, when you look at the post, you can see what my HUD stats look like that I'm looking at all the time. But then if I click on the VPIP stat, it'll do a pop-up of all of the pre-flop stats, and it'll be by position for, So I do have that available. I just don't have it displayed all the time.
Yeah, I think you want to know sample size too, because you can look at those numbers. You have to know how big of a sample size you have. I was going to post something funny before because I saw someone who had a VPIP of, I think it was like 20% or something like that over 50, 60 hands. But their VPIP from early position was 7 out of 9 times. They had raised from early position. And it was really crazy. And it was just funny because, or how it played out, because that person was me. That was me playing one time, and I was like trying to like figure out like why are I wonder what people are thinking because I'm constantly raising from under the gun. But it just happens to be the card distribution, and like the rest of the spots I'm folding. So you have to know what your sample size looks like because you can get weird anomalies like that.
That's a great point. And typically, you're going to see more HUD stats that deal with the flop and pre-flop than you will about turn and river. And just picking up what Taylor's saying, their sample size is a big part of that. Every hand goes pre-flop. A lot of hands go to the flop. A lot of hands just die on the flop. You don't get to many turns, and you sure don't get to many rivers. And you sure don't even get to beyond that to actually getting to showdown. So the further you get from pre-flop, the fewer numbers you're going to get, the fewer instances you're going to get. And so the pre-flop ones and the flop stats tend to be more reliable, faster. And so those tend to be the more reliable stats that people get used to using. I also find their c-bet percentage and their fold to c-bet percentage is really important. I also the HUD that I use is really stupidly complicated. It's got a bunch of stuff that would make other people like it wouldn't work for everyone. But for me, I can tell at a glance a lot about the player. So I've got a whole row that just deals with the flop. Are they donking? Are they folding to donking to donks? Are they floating? Are they check raising? Are they two betting generally? Those situations they don't come up as often, but most players are not balanced in those areas. And so if you can find any part of the decision tree where your opponents aren't balanced, that's going to help you out because you get to kind of make much more educated guesses about how to play against those kind of opponents. Well, that feels like a pretty good primer. I think if folks really want to get the most out of the conversation about how to deviate from the textbook and when, should really watch the deep dive for June that Chris has put together. We go into a lot more detail about various HUD stats, and we talk a lot more about live play and tells and that kind of thing, how we can use that information. Because it's one thing to know the information. It's another thing to know how to apply that information to the game of poker in real time. I mean, that's hard to do. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
Well, I just
was going to say. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Well, just that DJ asked a question in the chat, which I thought we could just sort of give a little thought to, which is, and I think that's sort of like after we see somebody like this who's been a maniac, and now they show ace four offsuit. We've just taken 137 big blind pot from them. Now we've got all these stats on this player, so we know they like have a tendency to be a maniac. But do we give them, if we're sitting at this table, we're playing in a cash game, and now we're in a similar situation. They've 3-bet, we're going deeper into a hand, they keep betting. Do we give them credit based on their stats, or do we give them credit based on, are they really doing this again? Aren't they going to make some adjustments? Like how do we differentiate between the type of player we've labeled and the stats we've collected versus like this happened an orbit ago, and are they really going to do this again?
It's a great question. I don't know if I can answer that question, but I'll answer a similar question. I think it matters a lot. I think they tend to adjust to you more quickly than they adjust to the rest of the table generally. Like, I think if someone's getting out of line and you've taken a bunch of chips out of their pocket by doing as Rob did here and calling them down light, they're going to remember that. And like the next hand they're in with you, they're not going to try and bluff you off. But I don't think they adjust to other players at the table. I think they continue their aggressive actions towards the other players because, like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. That's what just popped into my mind when I was thinking about this. What about you, Rob?
I think that's true. There's funny thing about this guy. He was on my left, obviously. So he had 3-bet me a number of times where I had just folded. So I think that might have had something to do with how he perceived me as being very tight, and I'm not going to call a lot of his 3-bets. So he was able to, try to just force me off a pot, thinking that I'm tighter than I am, but not understanding that I realized what he was doing and was able to counteract that. So I think, like I say, I'm probably 3 or 4 times I had folded to him after he 3-bet me, after I raised from the cutoff with whatever. So.
Yeah, and I think, and so DJ puts another comment in there. You can catch them not adjusting to you if they get caught by somebody else. Exactly. And I think the more stats that you have on these players, we're all ingrained in our ways. Like I'm an aggressive poker player. It would be very difficult for me to sit for a full session and not play the way that I have grown accustomed to playing. Maybe I could do it. Maybe I could do it. But it would be hard and weird, and I'd probably make other mistakes because I was trying to curve this one thing. So I think generally I would say just don't expect them to adjust until you actually see the proof, until you see showdowns of them tightening up, and even that's hard to see. Like, part of the problem is this is why I always encourage players to become more aggressive. It's the kind of play that it's most difficult to play against. Aggressive players, the only real way to combat them are by tightening up pre-flop and by calling down lighter. And those are hard things to do. But it's also hard to tell, like, are they tightening up or did they just, get worse hands for an orbit or two? It does make it kind of hard to tell. But I would say don't give them credit for changing until you've seen some evidence of that. Doug, I saw you unmute there. Yeah, jump in.
This is real game specific also. And when we change and how we change our play is also, like in a tournament, when you start with big stack sizes, you play differently than later in the tournament. I got to a final table last week, and I had played the last hour with less than 10 big blinds. Okay. Everybody at the final table, the big stack had 6. We were literally 6.
Wow.
It was a turbo type tournament. When you got there, the game was already over, right? And so you're playing Yahtzee poker at a final table of the tournament with a $5,000 first prize up there.
Right.
So it was a crazy situation. But that tournament also starts as Yahtzee poker because people are so loose and so crazy because they got 120 big blinds sitting in front of them, and it's a cheap $120 buy-in tournament, and the cash players say that's one bet, so
right. Yeah.
So if you have to what game you're playing and who you're playing. I have at our home game, I got probably more than 3,000 stats on quite a few players, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hands on them, and you have to pay attention to how they play early with a bigger stack versus later. What do they default to? Do they get more aggressive or do they get, more conservative as their stack shrinks? What happens there? And
I love that. That's a great perspective. And even, how ICM aware is this player, because we all should be adjusting our play for various points throughout the tournament. I think that's a really, really good point.
And ICM, of course, you mentioned that we've talked about it before on these things, but that was my tournament, was when you got down to, 15 big blinds, when weren't you all in? Well, ICM said, this hand doesn't go in here. And just keep, until you have 3 big blinds, you say, how did they get here? But, that.
Yeah. It's interesting, online. So I know some HUDs, like in Poker Tracker 4, you can have it, only look at certain stack sizes. So you can filter for certain stack sizes, which is one way that's helpful, because I do think some players play very differently short stacked versus deep stacked. But you can't automate everything. You can't have it track at what point in the tournament was it, or were they the big stack at the table. As Doug points out, a lot of these dynamics are going to come down to, the specific factors at play in that spot. So don't get married to it. This is the other thing I would say. People, you get kind of, but he had this VPIP and this PFR, so I had to. It's like, well, it's just be a nudge. It should be a nudge in one direction or the other. You don't ever want to make bad poker decisions just because, someone had a tell or an exploit. Okay, last question then, guys. Then we'll roll on out of here. If you're playing online, this probably won't apply. My question is sort of like, are there ways that you can disguise some of these live tells or exploits? Like, I think if you to play defense a bit, if you know what I mean. If you're online, all you can really do is play a mixed strategy, play polarized ranges in certain spots. That's going to make you unpredictable and difficult to play against. But if you're playing live, other than just kind of mum poker, Does anyone have any tips for players who feel like maybe they're giving up too much information, or maybe they're divulging too much about them and their experience? I mean, a couple that we've talked about, even as something as simple as having a card protector, that's not going to be like unwieldy or weird at the table, something like that. What's some other stuff? Chris, you unmuted there for a second.
Well, I think both online and live, I think one of the big things that players can work on is timing. It's such a dead giveaway. Even online, it can be a dead giveaway of something. I worry that this is something I have to sometimes think about online. I think I'm more susceptible to it online than live, where I'm probably doing that something because I just am like, sometimes I have a couple tables open and I'm like, oh, time to make a decision, and I can move on to the next one. And like, I really need to be careful about some of those kinds of things. I think that's a really big one that players should be conscious of. And sometimes using their time bank strategically can be a pretty important one I mean, not to just sort of slow down the game, but there are some times when that can actually work to your advantage. And similarly, in a live setting, I think that can be an important thing to incorporate.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, DJ in the chat saying, worked today on not using the auto fold and giving 5 seconds each decision. Yeah, I think that's great. Rob talks about this all the time. Just take your hand off the mouse. Give yourself those few seconds where you can't just autopilot. And not only does it give you the chance to avoid that, oh crap, moment when you act without thinking, but it also does kind of just regulate your timing a little bit, standardize your timing a bit, which will make you harder to play against, even if only incrementally. Well, folks, I think we had a really good conversation about that. So my thanks again to Rob for posting, of course, to Taylor and Chris for joining me here on the Wrecking Crew, to DJ and Doug, our premium members, and of course the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, and you, the listeners. We couldn't do it without you. So thanks for your support, and we'll see you next week right here. Good night, everybody.